Hey everyone, it's Dan, and today we're going to install these T-Rex crash bars on a 2018 Honda GROM. Now my first impression of these is pretty good. They feel nice and sturdy. They are made of steel, so they're a little bit heavy. And the finish on them and the welding seems to be pretty good. I also like the idea of a replaceable skid pad, so if the bike does fall over, it'll be easy just to switch over that part without having to paint or repair anything. My one nitpick, maybe if I had anything, and it's nothing major, would be the welding. Could use some polishing. The welds definitely look like they're strong, but they're could use a little bit of cleanup work to make them smoother. So pretty good quality. Not quite as good as maybe the Wunderlich ones, but should be a very good fit for this kind of bike. So this job is about a 2 out of 5 in terms of difficulty. Should take you about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to finish. You're going to need a couple of basic tools, a bunch of different sockets, so an 8, 12, 13, 14, 17 and a 19 millimeter, 5 and an 8 millimeter hex bit. U-joint makes it easier to get to one of the bolts, and a 17 millimeter combination or box wrench makes it easier to get to the other one. I also ended up using a hammer and a punch to move one of the bolts just a little bit. If you have that, use it. If not, screwdriver or even a piece of wood will work just fine. A couple of ratchets along with a torque wrench that works in the 30-35 foot-pound range, and a couple of extensions will help as well. Now, I do like to use thread locker on the bolts that are not the lock nylon type, and I also like to use masking tape to protect some of the bodywork and also parts of the bars from any friction that you might incur from extensions or a wrench that might either nudge it or just rub against it as you tighten it up. All right, so in this installation, there are going to be a couple of mounting points to the motorcycle. One of them will be right up here above the engine. Another one will be just behind the engine. And then the third one will be on the bottom to the engine. Right, so you got the 1, 2, and 3 mounting points. Additionally, there's a little tube over here that's going to join 2 of these together up in the front. And this is kind of how it fits together. So you got 1, 2, and 3 on the bottom. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is remove this cover, and in order to get access to it, we're going to have to move the rear set or rotate it just a little bit so that we could pull it out and attach the mounting points for the crash bars. So the way that we're going to do that is we will loosen the top bolt over here. So this is a long one that actually goes all the way through the swing arm, through the frame, and comes out the other side. You don't want to pull this guy out all the way because this is what actually holds the swing arm in place. So it's important that you keep it in place. All we want to do is loosen it just a little bit. Then we'll remove the bottom bolt and then swing this guy around. So I suspect that if I start just loosening the nut on the other side of the bike just by itself, it's just going to keep rotating. So I need to hold this in place. With it being on the other side of the bike, it might be a little bit difficult to hold everything. So what I'll do is I'll use one ratchet on the left-hand side. So this is going to be a 14 millimeter socket. We will set it up for loosening it. So now it's locked in place, and then I'll come around to the other side of the bike, and then I'll loosen and remove the nut from the other side. So on this side, it's a 19 millimeter socket. And this might take a little bit of torque. Remember, this is what holds the swing arm in place. And I do feel it rotating, so if I didn't have that wrench on the other side or had no way to hold it, then it would just keep spinning in place. So okay, so you've got a nut over here and also a washer. Now the next step will be just to move this bolt within the frame just a little bit. Don't push it all the way through. This is just to give you a little bit of leeway so that we can rotate the left rear set. So a little punch over here. You could also use a block of wood or a screwdriver if you have nothing else. Just be sure not to damage the threads. So do it right in the center. we'll give it just a couple of taps. Make sure that you don't push it all the way through. And now that the lock is removed from the right side of the bike, I can just pull this guy out, and then we're going to loosen and remove the bottom bolt. So the bottom is a 12 millimeter. This one came out pretty easily. Okay, and now I can easily move this back and forth here, which should allow me to remove the plastic cover. So for the plastic cover, this is an 8 millimeter bolt, so I'll use an 8 millimeter socket with an extension. There are, looks like 2 bolts holding this guy in place. So one on the bottom here, right there, and one up on the top. So this is a handy magnetic tool. A lot of times bolts tend to get stuck where you're pulling them from. So if the bolt happens to be ferrous, if it has iron in it, then this is a handy tool to help you either hold them in place or to remove them. The other thing to keep in mind is anytime there's multiple screws, I don't know what the size is going to be. They might be the same, they may not be the same. So it's always best to kind of arrange them in the order that they came out of so that it's easy to put everything back together. So I know this is the top bolt, so I'll just put it up on the top here. And then I'll remove the bottom one. And I'll put it under it, that way I know which one goes where. Okay, so the way to remove this is to get some needle nose pliers and actually squeeze the plastic tips to make that thinner and then pull it back out. So the next step will be to remove this bolt and also this bolt right here, which will serve as the 2 attachment points for the crash bars. The one thing that you need to be careful with though is that these things actually hold the engine onto the frame in addition to a couple of other things. So what you want to do is support the engine from the bottom just to make sure that it doesn't get tweaked on you or doesn't drop and then get misaligned. So I've got a little jack stand here. Should be able to fit it right underneath. That'll work really well. So right under this oil drain plug guard, and then I'll be able to catch the back thread here, and then also a solid point of the engine so that if something does get tweaked, it's not going to move, right? So this is nice and tight right now. Okay, so next up we'll use the same technique to hold this side in place while I unscrew the nut on the right side of the bike. So both the bolt side and the nut side on the other side are 14 millimeters. So I'll just use this ratchet over here. Make sure it's on the loose, and then this one I should be able to actually reach from the other side. And then from the right side of the bike, I've got a couple of extensions just to make things easier to get to. And then I've got one here, so I'll hold it on the right side. And I'll go ahead and break it loose here. And I'll do the same with the other one. And now I can fully remove the nuts from the right side of the bike. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and remove these one at a time. So for bolts like this, sometimes it helps to turn it with a wrench as you pull it back out. I will be replacing this one with the hardware that came with the kit, so I'm not so much concerned about some of the corrosion that I see here or about damaging the threads. This bolt is going to get tossed. Okay, and with the jack stand still supporting the engine, I will do the same thing with the other bolt. So from the other side, I'm using this push pin again, and then a hammer just to tap it out. Oh, that one's fully loose. So, hammer not required. Okay, so now that both of the top bolts are removed from the frame and the engine, it's time to mount the left side of the crash bars. So we're going to do that using the two long bolts that came with the kit. The longer one goes in the front, the slightly shorter one will go towards the back. Now on the front section, there are a couple of additional components that you're going to need to use. So the way that this will be installed is you have the bolt, you have the metal washer that comes with it. It's going to go through the hole like this. We're going to use a medium-sized or the 8mm spacer on this side. We're going to push this through the frame, and then we're going to use the longest or the biggest 22mm spacer on the other side with the washer and with the lock nut. Okay, so the one thing I want to do is wrap some masking tape around the sections that are going to come close to the screws, just so I don't scuff up the metal. So on a tube like that, the easiest thing to do is just to wrap around it. So I think it's somewhere right around here. And that way when I try to fight with this bolt, you know, it's not going to scuff up the frame or the tube here. So for this guy, I already have this washer in place. It's going to be like this. We'll add the spacer. So again, this is the 8mm, the medium-sized one, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so the front one was in, and now the shorter back bolt. So again, make sure you use the washer. And this one just slides right in. Okay, so next up, we're going to mount the right crash bar. So we're going to slide these two openings with the bolts that we've just installed through the frame. The other thing to keep in mind is there's a connecting part here that's going to mate with the left bar. So you want to make sure to align those as you pull all the pieces together. And also remember this 22mm spacer that has to go between this frame here and this opening. So I'm going to slide this guy in place here and wiggle it in. So for this bolt and for this bolt, remember we have these lock nuts, so no need for any thread locker. So we'll use the washer catch it with a lock nut. And same thing with the front. Now when it comes to parts like this, it's always a good idea to start them by hand before you use any kind of torque. You want to make sure that you don't risk the damaging or cross-threading the threads here. And now that I have both of the top engine bolts through the frame and just loosely in place with the lock nuts, I'm not worried about the engine moving around anymore. So I'll go ahead and just remove this floor jack. And next up, we're going to secure the 4 bolts from the bottom. So they are 2 different sizes. The 2 longer bolts are going to go up front into this opening and this opening, and then the 2 shorter bolts will go into the back ones. Now each of the bolts are going to have their own regular washer, but the 2 front bolts are also going to have one of the smallest spacers. So the way this will work is I'll take the longest bolt, I'll use my regular washer here. I want to use a little bit of thread lock. I'll slide it through the engine bolt or the crash bar here, through the spacer, and just loosely secure it with my hand. You may need to jiggle around the crash bar just a little bit to line up the holes. Definitely don't force it. If it's not going in by hand, you're doing it wrong. So the left one is in place. I'll do the same thing with the right side. So again, it's the longer bolt. We'll use a washer, some Loctite or thread locker. It's going to go through the crash guard here, through the spacer, and into the bottom of the engine here. Again, you may need to move this around to line it up, but the quality of these bars is actually really, really good. I didn't have to muscle anything to fit it in place. The only thing that gave me some trouble is the top engine bolt, and that's just because of alignment. So it's made really well. Everything is pretty good tolerances. Okay, so that guy's in by hand, and then we'll do the same thing for the back ones. The back ones, you'll just have a washer, thread locker, and it just goes right in. Okay, and all 4 of these guys are going to be a 13mm socket size. So first I'll tighten them by hand. And then the installation instructions call for about a 15 foot-pound torque, so we'll do that just to be sure. So I am using a torque wrench. Right, so now that all 4 of the bottom bolts are installed and torqued, we're going to go ahead and tighten up and torque the top 2 engine bolts. They want us to torque them to about 30 to 35 foot-pounds, so I set my torque wrench to 35 foot-pounds. I may need to hold them from the other side, so I've got a ratchet on the other side of the bike ready to go to make sure that I'm able to tighten these guys without spinning. So they are a little bit tight to get to, so we may need to get a little bit creative. I have a socket with an elbow joint here, so I should be able to get to the back one using this. For the front one, there's not much room here, so I may have to end up using just a box wrench. So we'll do the best that we can and tighten it to about 30, 35 foot-pounds. So whenever you're torquing anything with a joint like that, it's not the best scenario because it's going to alter the way that it feels, and you may not end up with an exact torque value. So the best thing that you can do is to try and keep it as straight as you can. All right, and for the top one, there's no way I'll be able to get to this with a socket, so I'm stuck using this guy. Okay, so that should just about do it. For the top bolt here, again, there's not really an easy way to torque this guy, so I got it about as tight as I can with the box wrench. It is a lock nut. I'm not worried about this guy flying loose, and it's in there nice and solid, so I'm not worried about any integrity issues. Okay, so right now everything is tightened and torqued to the right specs, so really the next step will be to replace or reinstall everything that we've had to remove to get the installation in place. So mainly we'll put the cover back on, we're going to realign this left rear set here, tighten up the bolts, and then we should be good to go. I'm going to reattach the cable bundle back here. So the easiest way for this guy to go in is to slide the top end first and then move it back. So there's a technique that makes it easier. And then now I should be able to latch the cable bundle back in. And this guy will just snap right back into place. And then now we should be able to reinstall the two 8mm bolts that hold the cover in place. So always start these guys by hand. And just tighten these nice and snug. So I got this guy in place. I did remove this bolt on the bottom, so I've got it right here. I'm going to use some thread locker just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Okay, so now that the bolt is in place, I'm going to torque it to about 30 foot-pounds. And finally, we're going to tighten up the top bolt on the rear sets here. Remember to make sure that the washer is still in place. Remember, we pushed this guy back a little bit at the beginning of the installation. This is already a lock nut like this, so no need for any thread locker. Start it by hand, just like always. I already have a socket and a ratchet on the other side of the bike holding this in place to make sure it doesn't spin around. So on this side over here, we'll just start it by hand. Make sure you got something on the other side to keep this from spinning. I had this extension on there and it actually spun the whole thing all the way around, so I will remove the extension so that we could use the foot peg as leverage. That way I don't have to hold the other side. Okay, so that's about hand tight. And then the next step here is I want to torque this guy. So I'll probably do it around 35 foot-pounds, just like the other engine bolts. So now that all the mounting bolts are torqued, I'm going to go ahead and tighten up the two friction bolts that are holding the right and the left bars together. I will use some Loctite on these to make sure they don't vibrate loose over time. And always start these guys by hand. And this is a 5mm bolt, so I'll loosen this one too. Add some thread locker. And start it by hand again. snug these guys up, do not over tighten them. Okay, and that should do it. I've got everything torqued. The connectors are nice and tight. I did use thread lock for anything that doesn't have a lock nut to make sure everything is secure. Overall, this installation was pretty straightforward, nice and easy. All the openings are in exactly the right places, so I didn't have to wrangle with this thing to try and force it into the right place like you sometimes have to with the cheaper engine guards. So I'm very happy with the quality of this guy and also with the ease of installation. So I hope you found this helpful. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I will see you next time.